It's so unusual to have four people who are so influential in their own fields to open up their own research for the dissection of someone else in a different field. And this is such an unusual conversation and a really unusual collective. So if I think I can, since Stephen Casper has already offered his response, if any of you would like to respond in turn on the brain as a metaphor.
I just thought that was a really interesting take on it. And I think that it's easy to lose sight of metaphors. You know, one of the things that I think becomes clear from listening to all the talks is how everyday metaphors are. People, you notice a metaphor when it's a particularly poetic or famous one, like Juliet is the sun, right? A famous metaphor. But it's easy to lose sight of how metaphorical so much of our language and so much of our thinking, at least I've tried to suggest, is. And so I think it is important for people to maintain an awareness of the sort of metaphors that guide their thinking and their attitudes towards various issues.
So let me just agree with one part of, I think, what both Stephen and Stephen brought out, which is that despite the fascination that we all have in, at least certainly I do, in the structure mappings between, can you all hear me? Is this loud enough? The structure mappings between complex systems, there's also an emotional value part that comes across. And that part might often be not recognized, but it can be very powerful. So I think it's useful to be reminded that what seems like a perfectly objective metaphor may actually be concealing many valenced ideas that we should keep an eye on.
Yeah, I have a quick question for Alexander on this impossibility of mapping metaphors. Has that, I mean, with what Stephen raised about Broca's area and locating a particular site and naming that site, how has your own research kind of been received in terms of the impossibility of mapping metaphors in a specific area and how it's exploded in a sense in the brain?
Well, I mean, I would say a lot of things that we heard from the other speakers have not been done yet. I mean, what has been done yet is do more or less a comparison between analogies and metaphors. And I would like to have Dedre perhaps comment again. Would you say that there is a fundamental difference between an analogy and a metaphor, or?
No, but there are cases of metaphor that we all call metaphor that are not analogy. For example, the voice of your eyes is deeper than all the roses. That's E.E. Cummings. You know, you understand when you read it in poetry that it's supposed to convey a sort of complex aesthetic feeling, but there's no clear structure mapping from one thing to the other. So I would call that a metaphor that is not an analogy. But many, many metaphors are analogies. Most of the ones we use all the time. And, you know, perhaps an analogy that's extremely mathematical, we might say, that doesn't sound like a metaphor. But really, the great bulk of things that we process on a daily basis could be called one or the other.
I mean, what I have perhaps done in my talk is perhaps just summarize what has been done so far, and it is impressive that most of the things that you both told us haven't been done. I mean, all the stuff about conceptual metaphors, I think it's just that no one has yet found the right paradigm for this.
Yeah.
I find myself wondering if maybe sociologists of science and people who work in the history of science have been thinking more actively about these things in terms of the social organization of science and specifically the social organization of scientific knowledge. I think back to this paper by Stephen Chapin in the 1970s called "The Proverbial Economy of Knowledge," which took a sort of stab very early on at trying to understand the way in which knowledge and consensus begin to emerge around forms of knowledge. In fact, I had a whole part on that in some original things that I tried to temper out, but one of the questions that I had for all of the panels, and really to open it up a little bit, was whether what we're looking at here is a kind of vernacular economy that we're trying to study in terms of both how the brain processes it and functions it, but then how we live in it or believe in it. It seems to me, I mean, we heard with Alex's talk, right? I mean, idioms, metaphors, analogies, similes, all of these, right? They each probably provide their own sociology in terms of the structure of scientific knowledge, and they probably also bring with them their own particular brain processes, which I think is sort of fascinating, and probably also embodiment.
I would open it up because, yeah, you've been listening to all this very patiently. Yeah, Pamela has a question to start with.
I'm just going to take one of these.
Sure.
Because I thought the last comment leads in well about, I take this, yes, to my question, which is, you know, all of you have focused on individuals. I mean, for example, Alex focused on, you know, individual fMRI studies. Stephen focused on individual survey participants, you know, individual children, I guess. And the question is, you know, metaphors have great power socially. And, you know, this is one of the problems, I guess, that neuroscientific research has encountered, which is that it can talk about individuals, but is a society just the sum of its individuals? And so, you know, does it tell us something, the workings of metaphor, you know, in individuals? Does that aggregate tell us something that maybe looking at the social dynamics or looking at the kinds of dynamics that Stephen Casper talked about, does that, it obviously gives us a different answer, but is there a kind of empirical solution to that?
You take this one.
Wait a minute.
That's a very nice
You're the one who
question.
talks about all these political things.
Well, I think to the extent that language is the primary medium of social order and social cooperation, and this was sort of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's original argument, that if you look at the metaphors in a particular culture, that those tell you, that offers, to use a metaphor, a window into the values, behaviors, thought processes of the culture as a whole. Yes, at the individual level, but really what they were doing was a linguistic analysis. And I think that's, to the extent that you believe that language is how we cooperate and how we make social order together, then I think that these linguistic metaphors do provide a way of starting to think about larger societal patterns and behaviors. One thing I will add is something that is implicated by some of this work, but no one said it explicitly yet, is that other more complex things can serve as metaphors. So I know Matteo studies visual metaphors, that's one, but stories, folk tales, narratives about our society, what is the American dream? You know, narratives themselves serve as sort of cultural metaphors that we learn as we become, you know, enculturated into our society as we grow and develop, that then themselves can structure our behavior in the social collective. I think what you're seeing right now, if you want to try to see how this kind of work at the individual level plays out at a societal level, one way of thinking about some of the clashes in society right now, some of the fundamental disagreements about literally the nature of reality, might be that the foundational kind of narratives or stories that function as the metaphors that people live by, those are really different in different groups of people in the United States. And when you have kind of media organizations and politicians and clergy, when you have them cohere around separate stories about the nature of reality, then you see these kind of what seem to be at the moment unbridgeable gaps.
Can I just quickly follow? Well, no, I won't follow up because I have a 10
Yes, this actually connects with what Stephen Flusberg was generalised with. I wonder if the thank you. Yeah, I wonder if the panelists would like to comment on an issue that Stephen Flusberg alluded to, and that's the role of metaphor in the arts, much more generally. So it raises two questions. First of all, it seems to be a pervasive phenomenon. So you read a short story by Thomas Mann, you realise it's about a clown, but actually it's about the political developments in Germany in the 30s. You experience a line break in a poem at the start of The Wasteland or something like that, and you hear it as the gap as breeding in that particular poem. You hear a piece of music metaphorically as something else, a change in mood, determination in the face of troubles or whatnot. I'd like to ask two questions about it. First of all, how the panelists would characterize this role in the arts. And secondly, it raises the issue of whether metaphor is fundamentally a linguistic phenomenon or not. Because in these cases in the arts, it does not seem to be a fundamentally linguistic phenomenon. So the question then arises, what's the relation between linguistic phenomena and more general cognitive capacity that's invoked in these cases?
Well, I'll say a bit on that, and then I think others will have something to say. Yes, first of all, I agree that it doesn't have to be linguistic. There has to be some sense of the structure of the two things. Music is a good example. There's no sense, I think, in which you have to apply words to a piece of music to pick up its patterns and perhaps have a pretty profound mapping onto emotions or situations or patterns that we experience in everyday life. So, for sure, I think we could experience metaphor without it being linguistically mediated. I think if I had to use one word for the role of metaphor in the arts, it would be complex. So there are times, for example, Shakespeare and Donne and the other Elizabethans would use gorgeous, clear, structurally perfect analogies with enormous emotional force. But you would have a hard time finding that in modern poetry. They seem a bit too pat, I think, a bit too obvious. Maybe I'm not sure. People, well, perhaps I'm speculating too much, but you don't generally find sort of a totally clear mapping from one place to another. There'll be some bits left out, and perhaps even some mixed metaphors, some autonomies, which are a different kind of figurative language. But still, you clearly see metaphor playing a role. It just seems to me a somewhat more complex role than say in Elizabethan times. So those are my two comments so far.
I would agree on that. It is perhaps more that what I have done so far is upon a linguistic phenomenon, but perhaps we haven't done the most interesting things yet, or he is closer to.
I have no answer to your questions per se, but I would make the observation that it's easy to forget. It's easy to forget about the way in which literary culture was structuring the imaginations of many of the past figures that I was alluding to very briefly in my talk. I mean, we have here a sort of genealogical component to the way literary culture has been changing. And I think when you're looking at concepts that took shape particularly in the 19th century, but also in the early 20th century, you would be looking at scientists who were immersed in forms of literary and artistic culture, and probably unself-consciously and also sometimes consciously translating between those things, because there is an inherent sometimes elegance or beauty that somebody sees in a gap in a poem that they suddenly import very directly into their work. And Sherrington's an extremely good example of one of these people who very much tried to bridge the two worlds divides. I mean, he would write his own verse, he would participate in poetic and philosophical discussions, and one could go on and on here in terms. I think it's very important to just sort of recognize that as a matter of the sociology, historically speaking, of the concepts that we sort of see taking shape in the mind and brain sciences.
Or in other words, neuroscientists with legacies are neuroscientists who are poets.
Yes.
Yeah, I have so much to say about this as well, but I'm going to have a chance later, so let's take a question from the back.
Is this working? I had a quick question about competing images and metaphors, which is, I mean, to take the example of Richard Nixon, when we think about the war on cancer that he declares in the 1950s, it doesn't have alternative images at that point of time, because cancer is new, and you have the cancer of communism and the war against cancer. But if you evoke the same things 20 years later, what do you do with competing images that are there? And that brings me back to Pamela's question. Across populations, this is a very, very different conception of metaphors because they're competing images. And my second linked question was really about age. I think there's a huge difference in the ways in which people understand metaphors across time. So I think chronology makes a huge difference across the life course. Children vis-a-vis older persons. So could you comment on this?
I'll comment on the first part. I think that's really interesting, and it's something that I think a lot about, which is that the impact of a metaphor depends on its context. And that means the larger societal context, that means the prior use of that and similar or different metaphors, and also how long it's been used, for example. So a lot of people in the United States supported the war in Afghanistan. I'm talking about a literal war in 2003. And now a vast majority of Americans do not support it. Literal wars, people get tired of. They're great for mobilizing a country together under some circumstances. That one happened to be everyone after 9/11. George W. Bush had a really high approval rating. It's hard to maybe remember that now, but he did. And then everyone, 90% of people in the United States supported a war against Afghanistan. And now most people don't have a great view of him, although for some reason it's getting better now, by contrast. And a lot of people, most people don't like that war, this endless war. The same thing, I think, happens, that same developmental process with metaphorical wars in particular. So I think that declaring a war on cancer or a war on drugs is a motivating force at first and mobilizes resources, but that if it drags on, if there's no clear mapping of when do we win, we like to win wars, we don't like to have them be endless, that can lead to a problem. And then, like you said, if there's a good alternative, a better alternative framing, then I think that is important for people to articulate. So when it comes to drugs, recasting it as a health crisis, for example, may be one effective way of making it, a better way to do it. So I'll let someone else handle the other part of the question.
So I'll just say one quick thing about children that I alluded to a bit in my talk. Very young children it has been said about young children that they can't process metaphors. I actually don't believe that's true. I think that it can look that way. For example, if you ask a young child, what does it mean if a person has a heart of stone? A child who's about 4 or 5 will say, people don't have hearts of stone. You can't have a stone instead of a heart. They seem to be being very literal. But if you make it clear that it's a metaphor, if you say, well, what would it mean if someone said that? Then they can often do it. They don't. So it's easy to underestimate how good children are at carrying out mappings unless you set up a situation where they know it's okay. If I say, what does it mean if I say a chair has a knee? They say, chairs can't have knees, but if you, actually I said that wrong. What does it mean to say a chair has a knee? A child will say, you can't say that, chairs don't have knees. But then you say, well, what would it mean if I said that? And they say, oh, well, it's probably that thing that bends, and they make a perfectly reasonable guess about where a knee would be on a chair. So children actually can do a lot of relational mapping if they know it's okay, if they sort of have permission to say something that isn't literally correct. But they are limited by how much they know. So the kind of complex metaphors that Stephen was describing would be very hard for a child who doesn't know anything about either war or politics. We need to know something, as Steve was showing in his diagrams, we need to know something about the source domain and something about the target domain to optimally process analogies and metaphors.
We'll just have time for 2 more questions, I think. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting panel. I'm curious because obviously there have been a lot of allusions to the fact that the sort of frame one has is very powerful, and those things can be used to a sort of to change and how people see things. But I wonder what it is actually and how much effort is required to switch it. So, for example, we've seen, for example, this backfire effect. For the more that you try to actually present people with facts inconsistent with their beliefs, the more it actually reinforces their beliefs. I wonder if there have been ways in which, a rigorous study's been done on actually trying to change people's understanding the framing through metaphor, and how easy it is, what is required to do it effectively or ineffectively, and also how it might involve trust or mistrust. If, for example, if it's understood that these people were really trying to play you and giving you certain one metaphor as opposed to another, whether how that affects how people accept that reframing.
Man, I wish I had a $10 million grant and I could tell you maybe the answers to those questions. Those are all amazing questions. I've thought of a lot of the same things. A lot of the work that I was presenting is the first work to really start to even empirically test whether, in a kind of rigorous, controlled way, whether metaphors can sway attitudes and beliefs. And there's still so much we don't know about it. So I think all these things that you're raising are really important. I just want to highlight that, I think the social pragmatics of the usage is key. And that's kind of what you're bringing on. So who's giving me this metaphor? If I'm a registered Democrat and Romney is sending me this pamphlet, I might double down on my own previously held belief. But if it's sent out as, the nonpartisan whatever foundation, now maybe that will change the effect. I have the same intuitions you do about all that stuff, but we just have not yet done the research. So really great questions. I wish I had an answer.
Actually, why don't we just collect questions so everyone will maybe, if we can just pass the mic around and have a couple questions.
I can make a very short response and say another part of this question of framing also is actor dependent in the sense of when do people start to make a different metaphor. And here I think as a sort of appeal to the history of science, one can see a sort of utility in looking at, for example, metaphors that neuroscientists use that they no longer use and trying to map those transformations. I mean, there's a very, very specific set of technological determinants that take us from the world of telegraphs and telephones to the world of computers. And in fact, I don't actually believe that sort of technological determinist viewpoint has really been thoroughly mapped out in the history of neuroscience. So there would be a way to study that question historically that wouldn't necessarily need a $10 million grant, but could perhaps be done with a $500,000 grant.
I was wondering if you can speculate if metaphor are specific kinds of mental processes, higher cognition processes. There is something unique about them which different from other thought processes. If they are actually closely associated with language or they're distinct. And what is the relation between cognition in general and metaphors? Are like all high cognition is basically metaphorical thinking? Or in the other way around, it's just one tool of like abstract thinking, just one of many other tools.
Can I answer that one, or do you want to wait until we get a whole bunch of them? It would be easier to answer them one at a time, I really think. So let me just say a quick thing about that. Number one, you asked is an analogy and metaphor unique, or does it connect to other processes? And also, does it require language? And I think you asked also, is it the only way to develop higher order cognition? Number one, I would say analogy is actually related to ordinary mundane similarity. So, and that's very important because that's often a stepping stone for little kids, and even for adults when they don't know anything about a domain. So if you give someone a very close comparison that may seem trivial to an adult, that actually can help the child get a tiny little abstraction that can then carry them further. And I think that's a lot of the way children learn abstract ideas. Not one big leap, but rather little steps that become big leaps. So it's related to ordinary similarity, and we do similarity all the time. That's what categorization is, in some sense, is grouping a bunch of similar things together and then being able to apply quickly that same category to others. And hamsters can do a certain amount of similarity-based categorization. So even animals that we would consider a lot less intelligent, a lot less abstract than humans, can do some similarity processes. And analogy, in a way, is the fancy version of ordinary similarity. are all, so I talk a lot about analogy, but and sometimes people say to me, do you think that's the only way that people think? Totally not. One other way that people think, and that's very powerful and important both in human and animals, is association. So association is not at all necessary to be abstract or fancy or analogical. Associations are things like butter goes with bread, and cows go with milk. There's no particular reason that we even necessarily know the particular relation, but we know these things are closely connected. When adult humans or even curious children think about these things, they may worry about what exactly is the nature of the connection. Is it a causal connection? Is it an origin connection, and so on? But you don't have to form an association. And really, those similarity and association are common to just about any mammal or bird. All kinds of species can do those two things. I think when you carry them to their refined versions is when you get abstract cognition.
So we just have one more in the front, and then, yeah.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm putting together two things like apples and oranges here, but I'm trying to put together the meta-analysis and the foci being all over the place in the brain, and there being no model of metaphor as a result of that, and a question of how does, like you've talked a lot about, finding different metaphors. Scientists try to come up with a metaphor, and but is it entirely a conscious process? What are the limits? Because do they arise subconsciously as well?
First of all, let me say, I don't think, if I understand Alexander, that he is saying there is no model of metaphor. He's saying that we don't know how, there is no clear region in the brain where metaphor is processed. Am I correct to say that? That is, you wouldn't argue that there's no cognitive model. You're saying that neurally we don't find a specific region.
Yes, but of course we've got to keep in mind what we are looking for. I'm more perhaps after those simple linguistic comparisons, and the other question is, why should there be one such model? Because as we learned from the other speakers, there is a lot of metaphorical thinking. Why should the brain use a different module for it? And that was at one time the idea in the 1990s, that there is such a model and that it is located in the right cerebral hemisphere. But as the longer I think about it, the more this would make no sense.
So let's see. So your question was, I think that was the first part of your question.
Yeah, I guess. I'm not even sure if I'm trying to put two things together that don't belong together, but I was wondering about if the brain pulls up information without intention that presents as a metaphor.
Yes, that can happen. So we have done one study where the metaphor wasn't a very distant one, but we were able to show that if we gave people a prior story, if we gave them one of two different versions, then they read various other things, and then they read a target that you can map onto one of the prior stories, they would interpret that later story in terms of whichever one of the earlier stories they read, and they wouldn't realize that they were doing that. So that's one example, and I think the work of Lara Boroditsky that Steve talked about, and Lara Boroditsky and Paul Thibodeau and Steve have done lovely work together. One of the things that some of that work shows is that people will be influenced by whether they hear something described as a crime, as a virus, or as an attacking beast. They'll be influenced by it, but not realize that it's the metaphor that influenced them. So that's metaphors that come in from the outside are not always recognized. I can't answer your question about whether we generate metaphors unconsciously, but I'm pretty sure we do. Certainly scientists, when they write about their creative process, that they say that. They say that the metaphor just came to them. So why not believe them?
I'll just add to that, and this might tie into the question about the relationship between metaphor and art. I heard a talk by the writer Michael Chabon last month, and at the end, people had written down questions, and he started answering them. And one of them was, how are you able to use so many interesting and vivid metaphors in your writing? And he just said, I've been asked this question a lot, and the answer is, that's just how I see the world. So he said, whenever I go somewhere, I see it in terms of something else. I was at the auto mechanic the other day, and I looked up, and there were these coiled cables, and I just said, oh, that's beautiful Arabic script. So he just described that. That's just how his mind works. More data needed, maybe.
And I suppose for me the answer is also yes, because what I'm inherently trying to call attention to is the fact that these things are not valueless. And one of my concerns is that even when they're invisible, if they're odious, they end up determining pathways of practice in the making of scientific knowledge. And I suppose in some sense there I'm articulating a sort of idea about both the deterministic processes played by culture, but also by the way unconscious behaviors end up materializing in the way we practice our lives. So yes.
So yeah, thank you so much for staying past this conversation on how to better practice metaphors in our lives, maybe. We hope to see you at the next PSSN event on December 9th, Educating the Brain. And please join me, December 4th, sorry. And please join me in thanking our 4 speakers.